Good evening. Welcome to the Italian Institute of Culture in Dublin. Buonasera a tutti. Welcome to an evening dedicated to Leonardo Sciascia in occasion of the 100 years of his birth. The discussion tonight will attempt to shed light on different aspects of the work of the Sicilian writer, essayist, and playwright, known for his anti-fascist stand with a special focus on fables from the dictatorship. My name is Marco Gioacchini. I'm the director of the Italian Institute of Culture in Dublin, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the city, albeit only virtually for the time being. Buonasera a tutti. Questa sera noi ospiteremo un evento di approfondimento dell'opera di Leonardo Sciascia e soprattutto per quanto riguarda la sua prima opera, e cioè Favole della dittatura, recentemente tradotta in lingua inglese. The evening tonight comprises contributions from 6 different personalities in the academic and publishing world, who will introduce Sciascia's work and his English translation by contextualizing it within Sciascia's wider opus. There is no need for me then to supply any further detail about the author and his work, as this is precisely what our contributors will be shortly delving into. I will now briefly touch upon the genesis of tonight's event. The initiative regarding Sciascia's Favole started with a proposal to the former director of the Italian Institute of Culture, Renata Sperandio, who agreed supporting the realization of a concert with new composed music on Sciascia's Fables by the Irish guitar composer Benjamin Dwyer. As finally she realized that no English translation of the Favole had been published, it was decided to ask one of the best translators from the Italian and authentic lover of Italian culture, Ann Goldstein. So the project turned into a shared effort between the Institutes of London, Edinburgh, and Dublin, of course, which cooperated to create a special edition of the text, available in a limited number of copies. It is therefore my obligation to extend my gratitude to the colleagues Katia Pizzi, Chiara Avanzato, Renato Sperandio, Nicola Locatelli, the Leonardo Sciascia estate, and everybody who played an active role in the realization of this project. Finally, my sincere thanks to Enrica Maria Ferrara, teaching fellow of Italian in Trinity College Dublin, who played a very important part in making this event possible and who will be our moderator for tonight. So I now pass the floor to Enrica, who will introduce our speakers. Thank you. Please, Enrica, go ahead. Thank you.
Leonardo Sciascia's literary legacy is immense, and much of his work still untranslated into English. Among his notable work translated into English, and I mean, this is going to be like a very quick and rough list. I'm just going to mention the most famous Il giorno della civetta, translated as The Day of the Owl in 1963 by Archibald Colquhoun and Arthur Oliver. And then we have Candido of 1977 that was translated into 1979 by Adrienne Fulk, A ciascuno il suo, and Il contesto, translated again by the Adrienne Fulk as To Each His Own and Equal Danger. And I would like to mention also the two of Sciascia's later work who were translated by Joe Farrell, who's here with us tonight. And they were Il Cavaliere e la Morte, The Night and Death, and Una Storia Semplice, A Straightforward Tale, both of them published in 1991, translated by Joe Farrell. Remaining in the realm of translation, and the occasion for tonight's celebration, which is already mentioned by Marco Gioacchini, is the translation of Leonardo Sciascia's debut work, Favole della dittatura. 71 years after their first publication, the Fables have found their English voice in Ann Goldstein's lean, sharp, and frankly wonderful translation. And we're very honored that Ann Goldstein has been able to join us tonight, and we'll later read an excerpt from the Fables. So without further ado, I will now move on to introduce the first speaker of tonight, whom we are really, really fortunate to have with us. One of the utmost experts on Sciascia worldwide and author of the introduction to the Fables. So Joe Farrell is Professor Emeritus of Italian at the University of Strathclyde. He has translated, as I said, 2 of Sciascia's work, later novels, and is currently working on a revised and reworked edition of the monograph on Sciascia that he first published in 1995. And among his numerous publications, I would like to mention at least his latest monograph, a study of dueling, titled Honor and the Sword, published by Signal Books in 2021, so this year. The title of Joe Farrell's talk is Sciascia's Fables, First Work or Prehistory?
Well, thank you very much, Enrica. I'm very glad to be here. I suppose I should apologize because everyone else will be using very sophisticated technological means, which are utterly beyond my very limited capacities. So you'll have to listen to me, and I will hold up 1 or 2 things in front of the camera, but the next time I'll try and learn better. I've given this talk of mine this title, Prehistory, or is it the first work? What I mean by that is that it has been difficult very often to categorize various of Sciascia's works, and that is the same with this one. In other words, do we have a writer who's struggling to find his voice? Let's remember that this book, which is, as we've already heard, was his first work. He was already 29 when he published it, which is rather older than most writers are. Further to that, it was a genre which he never subsequently attempted. He did write poetry, though once again that was only one particular work. Then he went on to write in a different way. So is there any continuity of this? Sciascia himself is not terribly helpful because although he came later on to acknowledge this work, for a long time he appears to have forgotten about it and referred to Le Parrocchie di Regal Petra as his first work. It was really the French who rediscovered these fables. Not for the first time we find French scholars awakening Italians to qualities of some of their writers which they had not noticed. However, the more important thing seems to me the fact that there is a continuity in the politics and also in the ethics. It's also the case that in some of his later works, we've already mentioned Candido, but some of his others, and he did refer to them as kind of fables. We could say, in other words, that he was always, the word is too harsh, but I think it's the only word he used. He always had didactic intentions. He had something to say, and the fables gave him a way of doing that. So this was his first work. It was published at his own expense, with only really very few copies published first of all. Annoyingly, we don't know exactly when he wrote the individual pieces. The book was published by a publisher called Bardi in Rome in 1950. But when did he actually write these pieces? Did he write them under fascism? Did he write them one by one in response to particular events? Or did he only write them in 1950? We simply don't know. And it would be interesting to know. Nevertheless, he was quite precise in what he was doing.
We can't hear you, Joe. I'm sorry. There is no audio.
Have I been speaking with passion and?
No. It's just in the last few seconds, maybe.
I'm very sorry. Well, I was talking with great passion. I'll not go back over it. Did you hear anything up until now?
Yes, we did. We did. Like just just like up to a few seconds ago. So like we were talking about.
An enemy has done this. Obviously, somebody is bored already and switched me off. I disclaim all responsibility. Anyway, I shall now continue. Do the best that I can. We've got the two sides. Fables means that he's operating in a precise tradition. A tradition which goes back to the Greeks and to the Romans, goes back to Aesop, goes back also in a more recent way to Jean de la Fontaine. Sciascia was always conscious of operating within traditions. For other works inside the Sicilian tradition, when he came to write detective stories, he studied quite deeply, read very deeply in Anglo-Americans. On the one hand, to start. On the other hand, it is then the story of fascism, the dictatorship. Neither the word fascism nor dictatorship occurs in any of the individual fables, but it is there, is there in the title. Sciascia was very unsure of himself in this, and he sought reassurance from all kinds of people. But on the other hand, he was also very precise about how he wanted them to be presented or represented. So we can talk about the two things then, the tradition of the fable. I will be relying, I apologize for not doing this, there's this very good book that you can only see backwards called La Favola Antica, published by Antonio Lapenna, which is an extremely good book on the tradition of the ancient fables. And Sciascia does quite deliberately hark back to them, talks about them. So all of the things come together in this work, various aspects, as I said, his politics and also his ethics. At the same time, someone tied to Italy, not specifically to Sicily in this particular case, but someone who was normally Sicilian and international, someone who was timeless and tied to his own age, someone who had a creative imagination but was rooted in reality, and above all, someone who was Sicilian and European. I hope this doesn't sound like a boast, but I did meet Sciascia once or twice, and one of the times he defined himself to me, and he said, and I quote, "Sono uno scrittore italiano che si occupa della Sicilia." That was not the only way he defined himself. Other times he offered a much more Sicilian view of his own identity as a writer. These fables are obviously not for children. These are bitter fables. That's once again something which is part of the tradition. In this book, Antonio Lapenna, talking about the ancient tradition of Aesop and Phaedrus, talks about the deep pessimism which there is in most, the overwhelming number. I know they later became stories for children, but that's not the way it was. One other important fact, when he was writing these, assuming, or at least when he was preparing for publication, he was reading George Orwell. Now, Orwell was a minor presence in his life, but of some importance. Well, about that time, he had written the obituary of Orwell, and it's not an accident that the two epigraphs, one is taken from Orwell. So that we have, in other words, someone rooted in the tradition of the fable, and then coming up specifically to Animal Farm. So the epigraph is the closing sentence of that. So we have all this in the background. What happens in the fable? Well, animals in the wild play the principal part, and readers in Sciascia are left to pick out the meaning for themselves. This is different, in other words, from the tradition of the fable, where normally a moral is stated. Sciascia does not do that. Some of the fables are frankly enigmatic and not easy to decipher, but the overall spirit is clear. Stripped of its pretenses, life under the dictatorship is life lived in a jungle, which no civilization can tame. There is no temperate zone. Power and strength are the dominant forces and the only ones which matter. There is no regard for the weak. The weak go to the wall, the weak are devoured, the weak are treated appallingly. The jungle, in other words, populated by animals, but does represent the state of nature in a wider sense. That's to say, before any 18th century notion of a social contract. This is a land, a fascist land, an Orwellian land at the same time, in which strength and power based on violence predominates. It could also be taken, but I don't think this was his intention, at least not consciously, as the basis of the role of the mafia, which is also based on power, violence alone. In other words, it's a bleak vision. But what does come out is Sciascia's abhorrence, which he never changed, of fascism and all forms of totalitarianism. On the other hand, he never directly refers to Mussolini, and by 1950, then the dictator in European terms was Stalin. And Sciascia was not a man in bad faith who would excuse in Stalin what was actually being perpetrated and denounced under Mussolini. Pasolini, as everyone knows, and happily it's been translated for this book, did a very, very insightful review of it. And he identified two elements which he said were the central ones for Sciascia's vision of fascism. They were dictatorship, but also servility. Servility, these two together. And some of the animals in here are powerful. Some others are those, for example, the nightingale, I take it in the one to be a reference to artists, poets under fascism who didn't wish to sing. But the tone is set beautifully, bringing all these things together in the first of the Fables, which is a rewriting of a classical tale of the wolf and the lamb, one which had recurred and was going back to Aesop, going back to Phaedrus, one which had been continually there. This was the image then of savagery on the one hand, and not of servility, but of weakness on the other hand, which is there. It is a symbol which has prowled around the European imagination over the centuries. Phaedrus gives us the main thing, and the opening line in Sciascia is a direct quote, which he even gives in Latin, coming from Phaedrus. Superior stabat lupus. And let's note, conscious of having a limited period of time, let's just note the fact that the wolf says, I know what you're thinking. There is a reference back that whereas in the classical versions of this tale, then the wolf has to find some excuse for killing and devouring the lamb. No such excuse is required this time. The wolf, whom we can identify with Mussolini, with Stalin, with any other tyrant you want, has no need for any justification. He's powerful, and that's all. And so he falls on and devours the lamb. This, as I said, is in keeping with the ancient version of it. I could quote, if you wish, in the Latin, Phaedrus, Haec propter illo scripta est homines fabula, qui fictis causus innocentes opprimat. There's no need to translate that for this company. But what it means is that the fable is written for those who oppress the innocent with fictitious or false pretexts. They don't need it. This is then the law of the stronger party, and that's what it is. I'll only refer then to two others because it can be a lightness of touch which to some extent heightens the dark reverberation. What are you to make, for example, of the mouse, who is a recurrent figure in the history of the fable, who's in a trap, one of those cage traps, where it lay quiet, filled with disgust and boredom, pitying the man staring at him, whom he knows the man will be his executioner, but it is the mouse who feels some sort of pity for the executioner. Is Sciascia referring to a specific character, Matteotti, for example, who was a recurrent figure in Sciascia's writing, or is it a description of the regime itself as a killing machine? The third fable in the collection is the briefest and the sharpest. I can read it. The dog barked all night at the moon, but the nightingale remained silent all night out of fear. Is the nightingale the figure of the poet? Is Sciascia pointing at those writers who, under Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, self-centered or chose silence out, or even covert complicity? Because some of the other creatures who are here are indeed people of fawning mendacity at various times. So what we have are some beautifully constructed, beautifully written, very short pieces, but there is no suggestion of the charm, which was often very falsely added on to Aesop or to Phaedrus. These are bitter pieces. It is apparently the case that there is a sort of pessimistic view of mankind, of humankind, sorry, I should say, underlying these tales in the classical writers. There is no such pretense in Sciascia. This is the expression of a bitterness, of a pessimism, which frankly never deserted Leonardo Sciascia, even when he wrote in different genres. So I have no hesitation, even against Sciascia at certain times, in saying that these were the first works on the basis of which he would continue, or the first works which express a vision which he never aroused and which came out in different forms in all of his subsequent works. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you. That was really, really beautiful and interesting. Despite the boycotting of technology boycotting you at the beginning, I will save any questions that we have for the end. So I'll introduce immediately the second speaker of tonight, who's the other extremely knowledgeable speaker on Sciascia that we have tonight is Mark Chu, who's senior lecturer in Italian at University College Cork. In fact, Mark was editor-in-chief of the first 3 issues of Todo Modo, the International Journal of Sciascia Studies, from 2011 to 2013. And so the journal Todo Modo is published by Leo Olszki and the Associazione degli Amici di Leonardo Sciascia. Mark Chu's talk tonight is titled The Fables from the Dictatorship in Their Political and Literary Context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Enrica. Thank you, Joe, and thank you very much to the Institute for organizing this. It's nice to see, I was looking at the participants, nice to see so many old friends and also people that I don't know. And so a very warm hello from a cold Cork to all of you. I am going to try and share my screen. I hope I will get this right now. Can you all see? Not yet. Can you see my first slide there?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, good. Right, so I now have to get into the presentation for myself as well. Okay, so I'd like to thank Joe as well for sending me in advance his introduction to this translation of the Favole della dittatura, which enabled me to avoid any overlap. I'm looking at the title of my talk this evening and the political and cultural context, and I'm realizing how presumptuous that is, that I might attempt to take on such a huge task in 12 minutes, but I'll give it a bash and see how it goes. So Joe Farrell, in his introduction to the translation of the Favole della dittatura, and here this evening, has presented a persuasive case for the work to be considered an integral part of Sciascia's production. tracing in this brief early text values and concerns which recur throughout his work. Joe has delved too into some of the intertextual references in the Fables, including Orwell. I'd like to focus here on the political and cultural climate at the time of the publication of the Fables, referring again to Orwell, but also looking at other references, including that in the second epigraph from Leo Longanesi's Parliamo dell'elefante, Let's Talk About the Elephant. The Favole were published at a tumultuous time in Italian history. The Resistenza had represented a diversity of views, but was a moment of national unity founded on anti-fascism, but this quickly fell apart in the post-war period. The 1946 institutional referendum saw the discredited monarchy, which for many represented nevertheless some kind of guarantee against communism, lose to the Republic by 54 to 46%, though not in the South. The 1948 parliamentary elections, the elezioni politiche, were the first conducted in the climate of polarization resulting from the Cold War. This was the period of the United States anti-communist investment in Europe through the Marshall Plan, as retold through the microcosm of the narrator's village in Sciascia's 1958 story, La Zia d'America. It was also the period of the Vatican's maximum involvement in Italian politics and its maximum commitment to the Christian Democrat Party, which presented itself to the electorate as the shield to protect Italy from communist assault. Culturally, many intellectuals, including those who had adhered to fascism, not only at the birth of the movement and perhaps in their youth, but well into the 1930s and in their own maturity, many of these intellectuals now embraced communism as a new form of intellectual conformity. As traced by Domenico Scarpa in an article published in Todo Modo, and I'm delighted to see among the participants here this evening, Francesco Izzo, the founder of that journal, as traced by Scarpa in a 2014 article in Todo Modo, in the immediate post-war years, Sciascia, who never joined any political party, moved from being close to the Italian Communist Party to active collaboration with Christian Democrat publications. And indeed, parts of the Favole first appeared in two Christian Democrat periodicals. 6 of the fables were first published in Sicilia del Popolo on the 21st of September 1948 under the title Favole per il Dittatore, Fables for the Dictator, which is slightly different from the definitive title. While 20 of the 27 texts appeared in the Palermo-based Christian Democrat periodical La Prova between the 1st of April and the 31st of May 1950 with the book's definitive title. Scarpa suggests that Sciascia's political position could be defined as un liberalismo in fieri, and involved a rejection of the cultural and political propaganda of both the Soviet Union and the United States. At the time, to hold such a stance was to run the risk of being associated with Guglielmo Giannini's right-wing and anti-communist populist Fronte dell'Uomo Qualunque, or Common Man's Front. But Sciascia's position distinguishes itself through his denunciation of social and economic conditions in Sicily, in various articles which would set the scene for his 1956 book, Le Parrocche di Regalpetra. One aspect of the political climate at the time can be seen, however, in these two cover cartoons from Giannini's L'Uomo Qualunque. On the left, we see the front page of the issue on the 9th of March 1949, where Stalin is depicted in a parody of Goya's Saturn devouring his son. While on the right, the 20th of December 1950 issue shows Truman and Stalin dicing the people with a mezzaluna, while each seeks to reassure his followers that he is in control and has the knife by the handle. This then is the climate at the time of the publication of the Favole. And with Orwell's 1945 anti-Stalinist fable, with the epigraph from Orwell's 1945 anti-Stalinist fable, the author distanced himself from communist intellectuals such as his fellow Sicilian, Elio Vittorini, who, like many of his contemporaries, after falling prey to the fascination of fascism in his youth, had swung to embrace the communist creed. Joe Farrell has already spoken of the first epigraph to the Favole from Orwell's Animal Farm and its well-known satire on the way Stalin's dictatorship had undermined the revolution. Given more time, I would comment on Sciascia's sometimes contradictory declarations about his own relationship to communism, and in particular his relationship to the character of Calogero Schirò, in his story La morte di Stalin, The Death of Stalin, also from 1958, published as one of the stories di Sicilia. The other epigraph from Leo Longanesi's Parliamo dell'elefante is almost certainly unfamiliar to the English language reader, and indeed to many Italian readers, so it might be worth providing some information about the work and its author in an effort to explain Sciascia's choice. Longanesi's book, the subtitle of which is Frammenti di un diario, Fragments of a Diary, is indeed a public diary covering the years 1938 to 1946. The author has been described in a recent study by Raffaele Liucci as a figure who transformed himself into the sharpest spokesperson for those of his compatriots who passed from fascism to post-fascism, without ever allowing himself to be contaminated by the resistance. Longanesi as a journalist was totally compromised with fascism, and yet many of his aphorisms, including the one used by Sciascia as an epigraph dated the 16th of June 1938, allow for an interpretation of the author's intentions as satirical. Even the propaganda slogans coined by Longanesi, such as Mussolini ha sempre ragione, Mussolini is always right, and La patria si serve anche facendo la sentinella ad un bidone di benzina, one serves one's fatherland even by guarding a can of petrol. Such slogans reveal, it is suggested, his pensare contro, this thinking against the mainstream, summed up by the author himself as believing but disobeying. Sciascia's choice of an epigraph by Longanesi, Longanesi being from a wealthy family, but whose bourgeois and strapaese beliefs allowed him to write in 1957 that poverty, la miseria, is Italy's only vital force and source of all that is beautiful there. Sciascia's choice of an epigraph by a figure such as Longanesi might seem surprising, but can perhaps be better explained if we look at the epigraph chosen by Longanesi for his book, which also gives it its title. Adapted from the 18th century Correspondance littéraire, philosophique et critique by Friedrich Melchior Baron von Grimm, the original text of which is shown here, it reads like this. Some days ago, Duclos said, "Gentlemen, let's talk about the elephant, a 5-year-old elephant, which at the time was arousing the curiosity of the Parisians. It is the only beast of a certain importance that one can talk about these days without danger." This epigraph suggests that Sciascia's choice of the fable form is ostensibly a way of defending himself from the recriminations of the targets of his satire, though of course those targets are clearly identifiable in the fables. That the objects of Sciascia's scorn in the Favole were the dictatorships of both left and right can be seen from an article published on the front page of La Prova on 10th of May 1951, and again cited by Domenico Scarpa, reminding Christian Democrat voters of the dangers of courting the right in the forthcoming elections. Quanti imbecilli, la più gigantesca 1001 notte della stupidità. Nell'essere stupidi furono di un fasto orientale. Il mondo forse non ha mai conosciuto un'era così totalmente votata alla stupidità, così fiera di essere stupida, così sprovvista del più elementare senso del ridicolo. Tragico è che gli italiani l'abbiano subita e che qualcuno oggi l'abbia addirittura dimenticata. This article, Vomito nella Patria, published shortly after the Favole, shows an affinity to the epigraph from Longanesi and articulates some of the critiques which Joe has so rightly points out are presented obliquely or even opaquely in the fables. And it takes us to another writer of the period, Sciascia's former teacher in Caltanissetta, Vitaliano Brancati, whose writings on the stupidity, boredom, and dictatorships which characterize the left, whose writings on stupidity and boredom, which characterizes dictatorships of the left and right, share many of the themes which we find in the Favole. but that would be a talk for another, but that would be an entirely different talk for which there is no time this evening. So I'll stop there with that reference there, my reference there to the two epigraphs and to the political and cultural climate of the period in which the Favole were published. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Definitely you have hit your target to try and cover some of the cultural and political period in which, in the connection in connection with the Fables. Very interesting indeed, and I'm sure there's going to be questions at the end, and definitely left me with the desire to know and understand a little bit more about the epigraphs. Longanesi sounds really interesting. So I will just move to Serena Todesco now, and I will introduce Serena, who's a literary translator and a scholar of Italian literature. Serena Todesco did her studies, or part of her studies, in Ireland, and our group and panel of scholars and writers is all, in a sense, has connections with Ireland. Serena is the author of Tracce a margine, a study on Sicilian women writers, and Campo a due, just published in 2021, an intergenerational dialogue on feminism and the South with Sicilian writer Maria Rosa Cutrufelli. So I leave now the floor to Serena, who's going to talk about reading Sciascia from the margins.
Thank you so much, Enrica, and thank you everyone to the Italian Cultural Institute of having me here tonight. As a child, I've always loved to play with kaleidoscopes, with their amazing ability to show by reversing perspectives, conveying invented and distorted miniatures, multiplying shades, fractals, and possible nuances. I think of the iridescent vision of a kaleidoscope as I attempt to circumscribe my relationship with the writings of Sciascia, a relationship that has much changed over recent years due to the fact that other reading practices have complicated my own connection with this author. I particularly refer to my interest towards the writings of Southern Italian women writers and towards the narrative mechanisms that in many ways subvert the canon of which Sciascia is, for better or for worse, a sophisticated, representative and authoritative figure. Still, perhaps even more intimately, my being a reader of Sciascia has much to do with my being a Sicilian who lives in an elsewhere, a Sicilian inhabiting a hybrid space, which often corresponds to a form of ego or a mere mental state. Inside this space, I find myself evoking or frantically searching for the signs of a relationship with the metamorphic space of an inner Sicily, which is of course largely nourished by my connection with Sicilian literature. In this sense, I can say that reading Sciascia before and after the pandemic and its suspended time has modified my rapport with the Sicilian landscape of my childhood and with the Sicilian space that I keep finding when browsing through the many Sciascia's books that populate my father's library. This is precisely when Sciascia's literature, along with its authorial persona and his being in the canon, reveal themselves to me as metamorphic entities that stimulate myself as a reader of Sicilian alterity and its literary spaces. Spaces that, as in a watermark, resurface through the texts of Sicilian women writers such as Maria Rosa Cutrufelli, Maria Attanasio, and Nadia Terranova. Today, I'd like to suggest how the act of resisting from Sicily, which is a liminal and peripheral space at the time of Sciascia's literary debut as much as it is today, intertwines this resistance with a female perspective that has drawn from Sciascia that same marginality, while also enriching it. The English edition of Tales from the Dictatorship is an excellent occasion to reflect upon the state of the art of literary Sicilianness and its intertwining with contemporary times. The tales from 1950 are often evoked in association with the poems that marked the debut of a young, yet already intuitive and brilliant Leonardo Sciascia, La Sicilia e il suo cuore. published in 1952, where the writer finds a linguistic and ethical dimension for himself by exploring a set of slow motion images that would eventually be scattered through his future novels and essays. As I reread consecutively the poems and the tales, I placed inside the same camera angle that land to be framed in the tranquil eye of the ox, dentro l'immobile occhio del bue, with its burned stalks of sticks, le stoppie bruciate, as well as within the rut made by the carts and the train tracks where that agonizing toad is placed in one of the tales. Between the field's ruts and the railway neatly dwells the microcosm of an impoverished and heart-wrenching post-war Sicily, which Sciascia was witnessing from his countryside observatory, that same harsh and mournful Sicily that Vittorini would describe as he tells the journey of Rosario and his father in the cities of the world. That Sicily corresponds to a land of long-lasting winters where, as Sciascia's poem Ad un paese lasciato recites, your old houses strangled the streets, and there is the somber stride of the Zolfatari, as if the roads concealed empty sepulchres, deep places of death. The tales and the poems are to be differently yet simultaneously situated in a political and personal event in Sciascia's life, as I see it, which is the choice of assuming the role of a southern intellectual who opposes resistance to fascism as he sets free from the scoria of a more essentialist 19th century meridionalismo. To problematize those scoria, I believe, has allowed and still allows us to constantly read Sciascia as an author standing on the border between regionalism and universalism, capable of shifting the body of anti-fascist memory in order to reposition it inside our daily debate, as much as across those remote fields, the Zolfatare, or the dusty roads of 20th century Sicily. Besides, anti-fascism is definitely part of a more extensive poetic of resistance that, stemming from the South, tells us of the relationship between Sicilian people and their space of belonging, thus pushing us to interrogate ourselves on what it means to look at Southern Italian literature, whereas urgent issues from the global South are coming to surface. Therefore, the alterity of Sciascia and Sicily, its tangible construction through raisonnement, especially but not only in the novels, may also be posing an ethical question beyond the intimidating weight of Sciascia as an author. It is a porous, yielding, changeable alterity, just like a kaleidoscope. For instance, we find it as insular spaces are narrated by other voices that answer to Sciascia, as they tell what he perhaps was unable to see while composing his tales. As still marginal microhistories tell us today, Sicilian resistance to fascism would dwell in the misery of women and men who, for instance, rebelled against the compulsory draft, thus starting the Non si parte movement between 1944 and 1945. From there, other words, other tales were born, tales of a Sicily historically framed between the 40s and the 50s. For example, the words and actions of Maria Occhipinti, who initiated the revolt in Ragusa, was condemned to solitary confinement in Ustica, then locked up in the Benedictines prison in Palermo. Occhipinti's crime had consisted in throwing her 5 months pregnant body in front of the military trucks that were coercively collecting young Ragusani, her fellow citizens. Her gesture may be defined by calling upon Karen Barrett's agential cut. The agential cut refers to a positioning that considers material complexity, the concrete and dynamic interactions between human beings and materiality itself, as well as observing given phenomena and their subsequent enacting apparatuses. What does this therefore mean for a woman like Occhipinti, who back in 1945 had created for herself an anti-fascism that was not merely opposing fascism itself, yet was also openly rebelling against the diktat of the Communist Party that was forcing rearmaments and coercive military drafts? Wasn't that the same problematic anti-fascism to which Sciascia refers? However, for Occhipinti, the gesture of throwing herself on the streets of Ragusa further meant to forge herself as a body in revolt, a body who believes in the ontological entanglement, in the intra-action between words and things. And here I'm quoting Liana Borghi's introduction to the Italian edition of Karen Barrett's Nature's Queer Performativity. Not by chance, in her memoir, Una donna di Ragusa, first published in 1957, Occhipinti would cry the simultaneous loss of both nature and land due to the need to reaffirm her freedom against the abuses of power. And she was saying, mi pareva che la parte migliore di me fosse fuori a respirare l'aria pura, a godersi il sole della mia terra. This plain and neat language reminds us of Candid Sciascia, who, as Gesualdo Bufalino wrote in a touching text right after the writer's death, had un'innocenza dei fini e una purezza intellettuale così partecipi che anche quando noi esitiamo a seguirlo mentre cerca di prendere le misure al disordine del mondo, ebbene, quelli sono i momenti in cui ci affascina di più e più gli vogliamo bene. Sciascia's title, evoking the dictatorship, whose multiple oppressions and long after effects inspired the tales, also tells us of a deeply political gesture, a bequest for future generations of male and female readers, a transfiguration of natural Sicilian spaces inside a subjective tension that would eventually expand in his future narratives. Rather than being borrowed from the world of those folk tales one reads during high school, as Pasolini states in his afterword, I would see those spaces, as rather nestled in the painful trauma of a fascism experienced from a peripheral and subaltern South, one that is inhabited by men like Sciascia, but also by women such as Occhipinti, both cast inside the great history of a South where, in spite of everything, a different post-war had been writing itself, like also Mark has previously hinted at. Different than the one of Partigiani, but no less significant. Today, more than ever, our literary South runs the risk of falling back into tiresome postcard-like images, which are as dusty as much as they're dangerously Orientalist, a Sicily product to be sold in the publishing world. I won't avoid here stating that, as Mark Chu has acutely observed in his beautiful essay, Sciascia and Sicily, Discourse and Actuality, a possible effect of Sciascia's opus has been one of leading to the construction of a discourse on Sicily, thus exposing itself to the risk of reifying the island's culture, the same risk we are running today as certain traits of the Sicilitudine get exasperated in order to satisfy the cultural industry. On the proverbial centrality of Sicilitudine, to be unique, to be typical, to be exceptional, as much as barren inside this exceptionality, I would be tempted to evoke a backlash that is always lurking, a perennial tendency for the literary Sicily towards a relapsing Orientalism. What would rather rescue that literary Sicily of which Sciascia is undoubtedly a foundational author? I'd suggest it is the multidimensional effective answers provided by Southern women writers and their spaces, their bodies and their stories of resistance to power structures. I will only here quote the lesson of Elena Ferrante, of course, but one may also think, we're talking about Sicily, of the transfigured spaces of Catania in Goliarda Sapienza's opus. And since we're today celebrating Ann Goldstein's excellent achievement, I would like to conclude by saying that the multilingual circulation of Southern women writers, of Southern writers in general, has also taught me how it is precisely through translations that can Sicily correspond to a deterritorialized rather than a rooted state of mind. In that case, the space of alterity of Sciascia's South may be unhinged and unlocked in even more original ways, because we can read and look at Sicily without letting it plunge back into its ambivalent uniqueness. And I thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Serena, for this very beautiful reading of this peripheral, or if you say it's in marginal, you know, like a vision in a sense, you know, like, or the vision from the margin. I really love the juxtaposition of the allegory of Sciascia's resistance, in a sense, of the anti-fascism and the whole embodied experience of anti-fascism of Occhipinti. Thank you very much for this reading. So our next speaker tonight is Cormac Cuilleanáin, who is a professor emeritus in Italian at Trinity College Dublin. Cormac has published widely on literary authors and on translation. He's been active as a translator. Notably, he has translated Boccaccio's Decameron, one of the translation of Boccaccio's Decameron in 2004. And he is also an occasional crime writer under the pseudonym Cormac Miller. I possibly shouldn't have said that, but I am. So Cormac's talk tonight is titled "The Acid Test of Wisdom. Does it translate?" Thank you.
Thank you. Now, I have managed to obscure the main thing that I have to work on here. It may never appear again.
We have your PowerPoint, Cormac.
Have I got? Am I screen sharing?
You are screen sharing, yes.
This is wonderful news. Thank you. So, oh dear. Let me see. Slideshow. How's that?
That is perfect.
Okay, listen, thank you very much. It's a wonder I'm able to do anything at all because, as you may hear, I'm dying of a cold in the head. So this is going to be about translation and the idea that if wisdom is valid in one time and place, it must be translatable into other times and places, and which is partly a eulogy of translation as an activity. So to put this into some kind of context, what have I done? I will start with what Joe was talking about, the didactic aspect of fables, and I'm going to talk a bit about proverbs as well, that they sometimes try to make us better or make us do things. Sometimes, however, they may just be philosophical, pointing out how dreadful life is. Beckett in Godot is not necessarily aiming to send you out of the theatre with a new determination to do good in the world. He just wants to make you realize that there is, as he says at the beginning, nothing to be done. So wisdom is a universal force. Tyranny, sadly, is a universal force. And I'm going to argue that animal imagery can show you something of what's at stake in human life. That's not very original. Yeah, the surrealism of animal stories, the fact we know they're slightly removed from our own reality, reminds us that in every local example of evil, there is also there's a universal aspect. So the miraculous, the visionary, these are various ways of getting at truths that would not be otherwise reachable. The animal stories with human messages are often arranged for children in a didactic way, but as we see with Sciascia, it is also possible to take them philosophically and just as an instance, as a reaction to the state of the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about animals and human nature, at first not through fables, but through proverbs. There's an Irish proverb that says, what would the cat's son do but kill a mouse? It's a very fine proverb. It means, scientifically, we are the prisoners of our heritage. We can't break out of it. But the nice way that that the wisdom is conveyed in English is things like father, like son. Or the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, but there are various ways of saying it. Tasach ma lerne hebre. A good start is half the work done. You notice a caesura there in the middle, the two little Spanish upside down exclamation marks. Ante no fuil loider, ni fordo veglik. The man who's not strong, he'd better be smart. So you set up something in the first half, you respond to it or knock it down or change it or attack it in the second half. Like the sonnet, like any other form, it has good possibilities. Now, where is my, yes. So what I'm trying to say is that wisdom and grim messages such as what we're talking about this evening are best conveyed if there are strong patterns and strong contrasts. The more haste, the less speed. That's the sort of didactic thing that parents say to children who are trying to get something done quickly. It may be good advice, but is it wisdom? Is it philosophy? I think not. The power of internal division, the internal tensions, which in real life would sink your boat. You see these 12th century Irishmen who are both assiduously rowing a boat, but in opposite directions. That's not a good way of getting around in a boat, but it is fine for creating a story, an internally contradictory story, or indeed a proverb, or indeed a fable. What I think is that the binary contrasts that you find in good proverbs can also be seen in fables, and you only have to look at the titles: the bat and the weasels, the ass and his driver, the boys and the frogs, the eagle and his captor. You set up a contrast between two beings or two forces, and they fight it out within the text. The language of the text then being absolutely essential to how it is done, and always with things that are well expressed in language. The better they're expressed, also, the worse it is for the translator, because you have to bring over not just the moral or the message, but also the form and how exactly it is done. And if you do that, what was local may indeed turn out to be universal. So what is translation? It's quite simple. It's threading an effortless path through constraint and impossibility, while of course maintaining tone, style, rhythm, and genre. And that up the top is Odysseus navigating his way through various problems such as a translator might encounter. Now, The Wolf and the Lamb we've already heard discussed. Sciascia doesn't even give us a title, still less a moral. Joe has dealt with that superior stabat lupus, which is fine. If you're going from Latin into Italian, it's a short hop. Most of your readers will work it out perfectly well, and you can work in other elements of the Latin into your text to show how educated you are. But if you're trying to do this in English, well, it's not the same language. Languages are kind of local. You could decide to take an old translation of it from English and then morph that into modern English. The wolf high up the current drank, the lamb far lower down the bank. But it's not really going to work. That is what I would call an impossibility. And in a way, with an impossibility, the thing to do is just put it out there and let it take its chances. So superior stabat lupus, and the lamb saw him. The violence of the end, lacerarlo, which may sound very strong in Italian, to me it sounds erudite and Latinate. Tearing him to bits is, in English, a fairly strong and unequivocal way of fixing it. Had I time, I would run through a recent Irish version in which the wolf comes up with all kinds of clever, but not clever enough, justifications for his proposed action. But the really sad thing about this version by the Irish writer Carlo Gabler is he calls it the clever lamb and the wolf. And, you know, we're programmed now to think that the cleverness will get you out of bad situations. But no, the pathos is even more increased in this version. So to reiterate Joe's view of the world of Aesop, rough justice, deep hurt, epic cruelty, unstinting monstrousness. Well, I suppose if an animal can't be a monster, who can? Well, that would be a man. The idea that the wolf doesn't have to give a reason or even engage in conversation is protested about by other writers of around the same time as Sciascia. Here is kein Warum, says the Nazi guard to Primo Levi. There's no asking why in these parts. Or Montale's protest against the purges that go on forever, senza un perché, so that which makes the hurt even worse. So yes, plenty of room for grimness in our modern age, as always. Another thing I enjoyed in this translation was the alternation of sharp language, sometimes very colloquial, and sometimes quite grand, and sometimes concealed literary devices. He found himself belly up, did the mouse. Si trovò rovesciato sotto le unghie del recente amico. Very nice and very concrete. But there's also the bit at the end. Yes, the cat responded, but I am a founder of the new kingdom, and sank his teeth into the mouse's back. That there is what we call an iambic pentameter. And it brings a poetic finality to the story, and indeed the poor mouse, in ways that if you had put in, and he sank his teeth, you would actually have lost that rhythm. Rhythm has got an awful lot to do with impact. So, to conclude, is this a book for Italy? As the publisher points out, we can recognize grand fascist bigwigs and dignitaries, or is it a book for the wider world? Of course, it's both. And how does it get to be a book for the wider world? Well, an ambiguous title, Fables from the Dictatorship, that leaves it open. Which dictatorship would we be talking about? Well, obviously, if Italian, our own one, but also everybody's. The world is sliding gently around the rims of democracy and dictatorship. At the moment, there will be plenty of future opportunities to apply the vision of Sciascia to the state of the world. Now, why is this not going to the next one? Oh dear. Right. Well, let me try to bring up this slideshow for my final shot. Yeah. Dictatorship, as I said at the start, like wisdom, like bitterness, is a universal phenomenon. And we can see in the particular misbehavior of given dictators, we can also see the basic underlying power relations that are at stake. And how does this broader dimension come to those of us who are not Italians? Well, obviously through translation, that other universal phenomenon that changes a national literature into world literature. And therefore, I will raise a metaphorical glass to translators everywhere, and especially this translator. So that was the end of my talk. I now morph into a different mode for a moment to introduce Enrica Ferrara, who teaches Italian in Trinity College. Among her many research projects are monograph on Calvino, various edited and jointly edited volumes on staged narratives, that would be literature and theatre, on post-humanism, and indeed articles on Elena Ferrante, Domenico Sternone, and there will be more next week and the week after. So I introduce our highly productive and wonderful colleague, Enrica Ferrara. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cormac. You're very kind. I really enjoyed your talk. There's going to be a bit, strangely, some overlap with mine, but I think it's all very good and interesting. In fact, you made me think a lot about patterns and performance, and this is a very nice link with my own talk. So, it's a quote, as I said, from Domenico Scarpa, and it talks about the fable and saying that sono favole classiche con gli animali, non permettono mai la lettura a chiave, sono favole antropologiche, so anthropological fables, e non politiche, della dittatura non mostrano la violenza, ma ne rivelano invece la procedura civile, ne lasciano emergere i moventi. Poi dice che le bestie sono caratteri immobili, figure araldiche a copertura degli eventi. So from this definition, we can see emerging three important aspects, and this is the aspects that I would like to focus on today. Firstly, I will elaborate on the theatrical element of the fables, in which the animals are similar to fixed types, caratteri immobili, like the stock characters of Commedia dell'arte, for example, or the puppets, pupi, of the Sicilian puppet theatre tradition. Secondly, but in close proximity with the first point, I would like to focus on the anthropological element of the fables, which indeed, despite their animal characters, have always the anthropos as their focus, or do they? As hinted in the Orwell epigraph, in the opera by Orwell, alluding at the confusive identity of humans and pigs, the fables play with the trope of human-animal interconnectedness, of course, to voice an anthropological meaning. But they do so precisely by undermining the traditional binary separation between animals as subjects and objects, animals and human as subjects and objects. So lastly, the last point I will focus on is on the detective work intrinsic in the somber gaze of the narrator, intent in scrutinizing the moventi, the motives behind certain actions. A gaze which, as Joe Farrell notes in the perceptive introduction, links the fables to the inquiry essays, such as The Disappearance of Majorana or Candido, that have, and I quote from Joe Farrell's introduction, a certain mood of fables and can be read as parables. So much of the fables' originality emerged from the fact that the animals in them embrace the role of performers. In keeping with the convention of fables as a genre, there is nothing exceptional in talking animals, as Cormac Cuilleanáin noted. But what we witness here is the performance of stiff animal puppets that could be coming straight out of teatro grottesco. For example, Rosso di San Secondo was an exponent of teatro grottesco at the beginning of the 20th century. Not perchance the metaphor of the gullible Sicilian fascists who behave like puppets in adoration of their dictator is later in Le Parrocchie di Regalpetra. And I quote from Sciascia's Le Parrocchie di Regalpetra: quei pupi che si agitavano sciocchi trascinavano ora tragiche ombre, grottesche ombre umane idropiche di paura. The animals of the fables resembled those foolish puppets dragging along huge shadows steeped in fear and a sense of grotesque, causing defamiliarization in the reader precisely because of their ability to perform, which is the odd thing in the fables. Now, there are a number of stylistic patterns of performance that can be detected in the fables, and I'll speak about patterns here. And I'm going with some research by German linguists Ute Burns and Irmgard Maassen. I haven't, I would have had the list of patterns on my slides, but I will just mention as these patterns of performance that we can see in the fables, or we can observe in Sciascia's fables. There is definitely a penchant for dialogue, for dialogization, and then the switching of perspective is very important, as I will say, and the playful reenacting of social models that we can see in the fables. It is primarily a performance of dark humor and a bitter performance, as has been remarked already tonight a few times, in which animals are able to outwit and dominate one another and remind humans of their kinship to animals. For example, in the story, in the second story that has been just cited by Cormac, when the mouse reminds the cat who's about to attack him that they live in a kingdom ruled by new order, a kingdom of peace, and the cat retorts that he has now become the founder of a new kingdom, and so he's able to kill the mouse. Perhaps Pasolini will have thought of this fable in his famous parable of the hawks and the sparrows, in which the two Franciscan friars go out to preach love to the birds, and despite having converted both species to the new kingdom of love, that kingdom is shattered when the hawk, driven by its killing instinct, lands on a sparrow and kills it. Now, the performance also occasionally entails an actual human-animal interaction in which the animal is able to look at the humans and empathize with them. This happens, for instance, in the story of the mouse who pities the human for his obsession with deathly thoughts, or the monkey who envies the human's beautiful uniform. In these two examples, the performative aspect is striking precisely because we have a human-animal interaction in which the animal behaves as a subject, emerging from its traditional position of object, of passive thing, rather than dragging along the shadows of human fear, as Sciascia said in the Le Parrocchie di Regal Petra, they cast their own. The animals cast their own. And finally, we have, and there is a beautiful fable, a full-fledged performance of animals who knowingly become actors and audience of a carnivalesque play in the story of the donkey, or as Ann Goldstein is translated, the ass who stumbles upon a huge lion's head made out of papier-mâché. Delighted with this disguise and posing as the king of the forest, the donkey runs across the fields and causes fear and confusion in the middle of a flock. And even if the old wether realizes the deceit, and so does a young lamb, they decide to continue treating the donkey like a lion to avoid its merciless kicks. So the moral of the story lies precisely in the distinctiveness of a performativity, of a performative dynamics in which animals are knowingly enacting the role of passive actors. Isn't this what humans believe the essence of animals to be? Passive objects devoid of consciousness. This is what, at least in Sciascia's time, was the concept. But Sciascia overturns the binary subject-object dynamics in this fable. It causes a sense of estrangement in its readers, who on the one hand identify with the animals because of their human ability to perform, but they're also perturbed by this proximity and by the elusive morale of the story. So this leads me to another observation, and that's linked to recent research in posthuman narratology. And according to Bernard, Marco Caracciolo, and others, non-human narratives are the result of a double dialectic of empathy and defamiliarization. So in other words, human readers empathize with non-human character based on a shared animality or on an instinctual ground, but also have to acknowledge the otherness of the non-human. And this causes defamiliarization, leading readers to question their own assumption and expectations. So in Sciascia's fables, we have several examples of this, of anthropomorphic traits attributed to animals to engender this sort of empathy. But at the same time, we have examples of defamiliarization. Now, I will not go into defamiliarization. This is linked to Victor Szlowski, Ostranenie. On the one hand, we say animal narrators and characters serve a purpose of identification with humans, as I said, producing emphasis. On the other hand, by defamiliarizing, by questioning our assumptions on both humans and animals. Now, Sciascia's contemporaries certainly didn't expect animals to have agency, but the above-mentioned stories of the mouse beating the human for his deathly thoughts, and the monkey envying the uniform, and the willing performance of the donkey and the flock certainly question generalized beliefs about animal agency. Now, in one case, and this is really interesting, defamiliarization lays bare the otherness of the animal simply by bringing out the specificity of being animal, what Heidegger calls captivation, that is the non-reflexive coupling of the animal and its environment. So Heidegger talks to us about the fact that if a bee were feeding on honey and an observer cut its abdomen, the bee would keep feeding as the honey spills out of its abdomen. So in other words, they wouldn't even realize that her abdomen is being cut. And similarly, Sciascia tells us the story of the fat pig who lies in bed asleep with a mouse gnawing on his belly. Because of its body mass, but also the presumed unconscious status of being animal that determines its sound sleep, the pig is not aware of the gnawing until the morning, when finding, and I quote from Ann's beautiful translation, a slippery cave of lard in his flank. Now, it is important to underline here, and I'm going to conclude soon, that the effort requested of the readers to decode the double dialectics of empathy and defamiliarization is huge, also because of the elliptic style of each tale, in which there is a sort of suspension. It is as if there was always an unknown, mysterious mental process dominating the story. The mind of Sciascia's omniscient narrator, big puppeteer, coincides with that of his readers, spectators conducting an inquiry. And even if the narrator is presumed to know more than his readers, he acts as a detective, and I quote, is in principle an outsider whose point of view may often coincide with that of the inquisitive reader trying to interpret the deceptive performance of characters who are not quite what they seem. And the quote is taken from an insightful essay written by Cormac of Cuilleanáin on theatricality of crime fiction, in particular Sciascia's The Day of the Owl. So what is the purpose of this inquiry? What is it that Sciascia is trying to achieve by questioning the human-animal boundaries? Possibly something similar to what Vittorini did when he featured talking dogs in his otherwise realistic novel Uomini e No, published in 1945. He poses, Sciascia and Vittorini, both of them do, pose the ethical question, reassessing the boundaries of what we conceive as human after the wretched time of every dictatorship. And Sciascia does that precisely to avoid what Pasolini seems to fear in his introduction, that the dictatorship might be remembered as a surreal fairy tale. Now, that it does so in the style of the Fables rather than in a realistic manner, such as an inquiry essay, is consistent with what he thought as regards the use of style as a tool for historical narratives. Sciascia refers that to Calvino when he critiques or he writes a review for Calvino's Barone Rampante, and he says that Calvino remained faithful to his poetic world, whether he dealt with the realistic subject matter, for example, writing about the partisan war, or on the contrary, if he explored the dimension of the fairy tale. Because Sciascia says Calvino is the first and foremost faithful to history with a capital H, and this fedeltà alla storia, faithfulness to history, may sum up, in my opinion, also Sciascia's intentions with his fables. Thank you very much, and sorry about the technical issue. Now, I will introduce Ann Goldstein, who really needs no introduction, but I'll do it anyway because it is my pleasure to introduce Ann, who is, sorry, I have it here, and I had it back here on, I seem to be having a lot of issues. Sorry, Ann.
I need no introduction.
No, like you do need an introduction. She's a fabulous translator. She's translated, and she had this, the collected work of Primo Levi. I know this by heart, you see. So, and she's translated the complete work of Corsin of Elena Ferrante. She translated Baricco, and you can say that she is very distinguished and possibly the best known translator in the Italian cultural scene. So I'm so happy to have Ann reading an excerpt, and I don't know if you want to share the screen or you're just going to.
No, I'm not doing no technical, nothing technical.
Thank you very much.
The translation itself is hard enough, as all of you have pointed out.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to read a little bit from the Pasolini afterword, because first of all, because next year is Pasolini's centenary, I believe, and also because it does give a little context. And what I say, I think will probably be it will repeat some of the things that other people have said and other quotations. Anyway. So Pasolini was writing in 1951, right after this came out. 10 years ago, these fables would have served uniquely to send their author into exile. How many Italians would have been able to understand them? Now, with a store of bitterness taken for granted, Sciascia in memory condemns those fables, laying a taste for the succinct, static, almost hermetic form, which in those times was one of the rare modes of passive resistance. And here we repeat is the immediate interest of this slim volume, if there's even a need to have one. But what counts is its value as poetry. Many of these fables conclude like short lyrics, and we might also cite the small images of Alexandrian poetry or Oriental Majolica or popular lyric, maybe even Sicilian, just to give the reader an idea of the language. And also in literary terms, we could place it approximately between two of his fellow countrymen, Quasimodo with his unmoving word reflected from the Greek, and Brancati with his bitter, biting discursiveness. So that a sensitive reader cares little about recognizing in the man encased and rigid in all that splendor, Ciano and Starace, or in the monkey, himself or one of the many millions of ordinary Italians. This terse, immutable language is too strong a guarantor of an actuality that isn't vulgar. And we read with what intense emotion, unyielding to sentiment, etches the figure of the condemned politician into the evocation of the fable. This is part of one of the fables, which I think has already been cited. In the trap, one of those cage traps, the mouse was quiet, filled with disgust and boredom. The man came into the kitchen and stood looking at him. When the mouse met the man's eyes, he understood that he was choosing a type of death for him. Poor fellow, he thought, he's thinking about it more than I am, who have to die. The oppressive, tragic element of the dictatorship plays a large role in these light pages, but it's transposed into rapid phrases, into comments that gloss over yet make us shiver. But even these sudden flashes, these drops of clotted blood, are absorbed in the context of the language, so pure that the reader wonders if perhaps its very content, the dictatorship, was not a fable, as Enrica said. And here are some of the fables. In fact, here's the Superior Stabat Lupus. Superior Stabat Lupus. And the lamb saw him in the murky mirror of the water. He stopped drinking and, trembling, stared at that terrifying reflected image. Now I have no time to waste, said the wolf, and I have an argument against you that's much stronger than the old one. I know what you think of me, and don't try to deny it. And with a leap, he was on him, tearing him to bits. The monkeys preached the new order, the kingdom of peace, and among the first supporters were the tiger, the cat, and the kite. Gradually, all the other animals were persuaded, and it was such sweet joy, a brotherly vegetarian love feast. But one day, as the mouse was playing politely with the cat, he found himself belly up under the claws of his recent friend. He realized that the old days were back. With wavering hope, he reminded the cat of the new kingdom's principles. Yes, the cat responded, but I am a founder of the new kingdom, and sank his teeth into the mouse's back. The dog barked at the moon, but the nightingale was silenced all night by fear. The fox mocked the raven because he was black. Wait till you see the effect when I stand on the pallid bust of Pallas, screeched the raven. The fox didn't know about Edgar Allan Poe, but inside he felt a kind of strident, cold crack. The pig was so fat that for a whole night he didn't feel the mouse gnawing at his flank. Between sleeping and waking in the middle of the night, he felt only a pleasant tickle, so pleasant that it plunged him again into deepest sleep. At dawn, when he started to wake up, grunting, the mouse fled, leaving a slippery cave of lard in his flank. The lion ate his large meal greedily, and the wolf nearby whined with hunger. With the last bone picked clean, the lion seemed to notice that frantic lament. I hope you won't complain about my meal. If I eat, it's only for you that I do it. In fact, you wouldn't know how to live without me. And the wolf, certainly without you we would die, but maybe we wouldn't die of hunger. The old horse, aching and sore, wouldn't go near the manger until the mule left. And the mule thought, yes, you may be a purebred, but the hay you eat is what I leave you. The snail was fooled by a bucket of water overturned among the stones and the ice-cold night. With intense pleasure, he slowly moved his jelly-like body along the wet stones, dragging his shell, and felt in the damp fragrance of the earth the auspicious change of season. But the way was long within that large pile of stones. The sun was already sizzling when the snail emerged. There was a big moon, and the farmer's dog and the rabbit, separated by barbed wire, were quietly negotiating. The rabbit said, "You don't eat vegetables. The master treats you to bran and kicks you. You could sleep tranquilly at night, leaving me in peace among the greens and melons." The fact that you scare me doesn't mean that your condition is better than mine. We should recognize each other as brothers. The dog listened to him, lazily stretched out, his muzzle resting on his paws. And then, what you say is true, but for me, nothing is worth the pleasure of scaring you. Looking at the man in uniform, encased and rigid in all that splendor, the monkey thought, basically, my situation isn't bad. I eat well, I do my gymnastics, the people who crowd around the cage amuse me, but I'd very much like to have an outfit like his. And then this is the last one. I mean, the last one, I'm going to read the last one in the book. The cock had crowed twice, and the cold gray sky was veined with pink. Suddenly, in the darkness of the hen house, the cruel presence of the weasel could be heard. Madly, the hens flew to the perches, and to the perches, and the cock turned toward the sound of the weasel, hunched and crouching to spring. It was on him in an instant, and he felt the weasel bite sharply, greedily, into his neck, and suck and suck. In the adjacent house, the man waited in vain for the cock to crow a third time. He sank back under the covers and in his sleep pushed away the ready remorse. Thanks.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
They're gorgeous. Thank you so much for this reading, and we really are lucky and fortunate tonight to hear them from you. And okay, so I would like now, it's 7:35. I would like to ask the audience and to open the floor to questions for a few minutes. If there is anyone who would like to ask questions to any of the speakers tonight, you're very welcome to put them in the chat. And I should have solicited and invited questions beforehand. I would like to ask Anne, since I can take advantage of my position as a moderator, and I would like to ask Anne, what was the most difficult, if I may, what was the most difficult in translation to Fables? The tone, certain words, the humor?
Well, all of the above.
Okay.
I mean, I've always sworn that I would never translate poetry. And this is kind of like translating poetry. You know, every word has to count, and it's hard to get the tone. It's hard to get sometimes the words themselves. And besides, they're very they're hard to understand in some ways, and some more than others. But so I would say all of the things that are I forgot. Oh, the Scylla and Charybdis of every translation was sort of intensified.
Yes, and you are right, absolutely right. I think to say that they are like poetry because every word counts. And I think Serena has remarked as well in the strong connection, and Joe, the strong connection between the collection of poems, La Sicilia, and you know, that collection of poetry still needs a voice. So you might rethink your
I don't know
your reluctance to translate poetry, since you've done such an amazing job with the Fables. You might want to do it. Yes, I would like to ask maybe if the speakers, any of the speakers, have any questions for each other, or for Ann Goldstein, or anyone would like to intervene. Okay, so we have a lot of thank you in the chat. Yes, so can I ask one question to the speakers? It's just a very simple question, but you're going to have to tell me why. What is your favorite fable? Can I ask, starting from, you know, for anyone who wants to speak, but since Anne is here, what is your favorite fable? And I would like to ask each of the speakers.
I couldn't possibly have a favorite fable.
They were all a bit of a headache, maybe. So
no, but they all have different aspects that are wonderful.
Yes,
difficult.
Absolutely, yeah. Joe, would you have a favorite fable? Joe Farrell. I can't.
I've actually just picked up the fables to flick through them very rapidly to to see if there was one that sort of. I had never thought of that terms. Some of them are very difficult to understand. I suppose I would. Now you need to give me a bit more time for that. Actually, the overall things. Well, I'll tell you the one I would go, but I mean it's a very brutal one. The one dealing with the fox. Sorry, I don't know where it comes. La volpe dolcemente lo adorava, Leone, and so on. I like the way it's building up. I mean, that is not so much a poem as a kind of short story, very briefly told, and ending up with this single line, the final line, which is devastating, that the deer was pulled apart. But I like the concision of that. I like the way that he can bring together a number of characters, give us something unexpected about the fox or Leonardo, and then end up with a bitter final line. I think that's a very powerful story on its own, and then it's one which you would require to think about what does it actually mean, what's he actually getting at, which I do find some of these fables very enigmatic, and it is interesting that whereas in the classic fables we were given a moral, Sciascia never does that. He leaves it to you, and I think this is a particularly effective fable.
Yes, and it's interesting that it doesn't give us the moral behind. So it's readers. As I was saying, this was like my particular inclination. You know, what I thought. You know, like my particular opinion about the fables that that this elliptic and this suspension that Sciascia leaves is for the reader to feel. Of course, the moral with meanings, and all fables do that a little bit. But in Sciascia's case, this is particularly distinctive and particularly pronounced, as you noticed. So can I ask any of the other speakers who would like to elaborate on one fable in particular, or they have a favorite?
I can tell you if you want.
Oh, yes. Please.
But for me, I think the last one struck me particularly because it somehow closes. I imagine the fables as a 24-hour cycle, something that stretches along 24 hours, like from one morning to the next morning. And that warning of the man actually refusing to hear the call of the cock who can't sing a third time, that was kind of a perfectly fitting with the context that Joe and Mark gave, particularly the fact that we should be warned again against new forms of dictatorship. I found it particularly powerful.
Yes, beautiful. You're absolutely right about that. You know, like our inability to and even and that kind of probably ties in very well with the story of the pig who sleeps, and then there is the mouse knowing at his flank before he knows there is a cave in his flank, you know, like, so
his slumber coming.
Yes.
And it was really particularly effective to me.
Yes, okay.
I could visualize them. I don't know, there was a cinematic quality to those.
And this is like one of the aspects that is absolutely beautiful is this iconic and visual feel of the fables. Does Cormac want to tell us what is his favorite?
Okay, I'm just looking at one here now. I'm looking at it in the translation, but it's a TypeScript translation, so it may not be the final printed version. The ass had a very sensitive soul and even came up with verses. But when his master died, he confided, "I loved him. Every beating inspired a rhyme." You think of those people who, the great musicians under the Stalinist era, who worked away and they were tolerated and they were sometimes even praised. And, you know, Bulgakov's play, Stalin went to see it many times. When it's being patted on the head, but always with the idea that your head could also be knocked off at any moment. So then there's also us. I mean, we as people appreciating the art, we say, "Isn't that lovely? Really inspiring symphony, Mr. Shostakovich. You know, all the suffering you went through was well worth it." So that position of the man of culture under the dictator, there's so much sort of ambiguity. It may even be self-deception. All the good people who did good work that didn't happen to transgress any of the lines of the tyranny. You know, those are fairly wounding little lines. By the way, I have a question for the institute. Where is the printed book and how can we get it?
The printed book will be out in a few weeks, probably, I mean, beginning of December.
Mm-hmm.
And we are going to wait for delivery from the printer.
Yes.
And then send to the department of the university that will manage with the book. So you only have a copy, of course.
It is imminent. That good. I look forward to that.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Very much so. And so maybe before Marco Giacchini, this is like a little wrap-up conclusions. We'd like to ask Mark if he has a favorite fables. That is all the speakers then. And if there is anyone else, of course, in the audience who want to intervene.
I suppose the one that captures my attention is the story of the mouse in the cage, imagining the man thinking of how he's going to put him to death, which is the sort of this ability to resist the dictatorship, even though you're losing, this sort of intellectual victory over the oppressors, which the mouse has. And I think that it ties in with some of the what I might have said if I had time to talk about Brancati as well. But it's also it makes me think of another Sciascia, the Sciascia who describes Francesco Paolo di Blasi as he's being tortured, and that sort of ability of the to overcome torture with the intellect, or to overcome oppression with the intellect, which of course, I mean, is a sort of Pyrrhic victory, but nevertheless, it's a form in a way. I mean, I suppose it's in its negativity, it's all nevertheless quite positive in that it shows that dictatorship never truly wins as long as there are people who in their mind resist.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, like that's a very, very interesting point. And I think this is one of the reason why the emphasis in the story, the first story, is on the fact that the lamb actually thinks. It's not just on what, I don't know, like what everyone else thinks, but it's not just what the lamb thinks of the wolf, but it's the fact that the lamb thinks, in a sense, like that, and in tying in with what you're saying, Mark, about like the ability of the mouse to look through the mind of the dictator, and resisting in this way. So the intellectual ability, it's very, very defining, in those fables. Okay, so I think, like if the audience doesn't have, and I think through the chat, let me see, there is no questions, and interesting, even if everyone is thanking the speakers. I think I would like to thank the speakers myself, and thank the Institute, Marco Giacchini and Deborah Biancheri, for organizing this beautiful event. And I would like now to leave the floor to Marco Giacchini for his conclusive remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Enrica. Thank you all the contributors that made such interesting papers and spoke so deeply about the work, the first work of Leonardo Sciascia. I think it would have been honored to know that after 71 years we can analyze so deeply his first work. I would like only to underline one point, that there is always need to speak of and against dictatorship, even now in the present days and the future days. So thank you very much for your contribution. I want only to point out that the meeting I've been hosting tonight has been proposed in English, with the idea of opening up the dialogue with the Anglophone world, and which is the same goal pursued by the Lezioni Sciasciane, Sciascian lessons in the world, that the Institute of Culture in London and in San Francisco will host the 9th of December as another virtual event, this time as part of a series of initiatives coordinated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the National Committee of the Centenary of Leonardo Sciascia, together with Associazione Amici di Leonardo Sciascia, Todomodo Journal, the University for Foreigners of Perugia, Treccani Institute of the Italian Encyclopedia, and the publisher Olsky. So please remember to save the date and meet again on the 9th of December. Thank you very much. Grazie a tutti e arrivederci da Dublino. Grazie.
Ciao.